So that's what we want to entail in this workshop. We will have the participation of Gabrielle. She is the senior legal of Article 19 on lead on internet law and policy at the organization. We have Harry Halpin. He is from MIT Computer Science. We have Albana Tachi from the Council of Europe Secretary. And we will have, arriving later, Eleonora Rabinovich from Google. So Gabrielle will give us, in the first moment, a framework that could help us and introduce the issues around this right to protest online.
Thanks, Paulina. Thanks, everyone, for joining us today. As you know, protests are very topical. We've seen a lot of them, from the protests in Gezi Park in Turkey to protests in Ukraine, in Europe, in the United Kingdom, for instance. We've seen protests happening against austerity measures. But there hasn't really been a reflection about what the framework should be from a human rights standpoint around the right to protest as such, let alone around the right to protest online. So what I'm going to try to do today is two things. One, I'm going to go through what Article 19 has been thinking about and thinking about the right to protest, what we think it engages in terms of other rights. I'm going to go through some of the issues that arise offline, and then move on to some of the issues that arise online from a free expression perspective, but also in relation to issues such as surveillance and reporting on protests. So what is the right to protest? If you look at various international instruments, you won't find a right to protest as such. In reality, it engages a number of other rights and freedoms. So I've listed some of them here. Freedom of expression, freedom of assembly and association, the right to liberty and security, insofar as it relates to detention, the prohibition of torture and degrading treatments, if you think about police violence, for instance. The right to life would also be relevant, and the right to privacy. So what does Article 19 think about a possible definition of the right to protest? We've been developing, in partnership with others, some right to protest principles, and I'm going to come to that in a minute. But when thinking about the right to protest, what we've come up with is the fact that the right to protest, unlike the right to freedom of expression, which tends to be exercised in an individual capacity, it has a collective element, and it's usually the collective expression of oppositional, dissenting, reactive or responsive views, values, or interests. Now, when we think about the right to protest and how it applies offline, we usually look at the permissible restrictions on freedom of expression. And it's a protest, and it's set out here, the fact that the restriction on protest is set out by law, which are sufficiently clear. There's the legitimate aim, which in this case would be the prevention of criminal activity, or upholding public safety, public order, and whether the measure is necessary and proportionate in a democratic society. Now, if we look at the right to freedom of assembly and association, it is actually, traditionally it's been a rather weak right, because it's very much linked to the policing of protests. And because it's also about the use of physical space, traditionally there have been a number of restrictions on the time of protests, so that some protests can't be held indefinitely. In terms of place, sometimes protesters are told that they can't protest in front of, for example, the embassy or other public building where they want to protest, but they have to go somewhere else, which might be completely outside of the way, in a place where it would not draw the attention to the issue that they're seeking to protest about. And ultimately, it's really looking at how much the expressive activity involved in protests is causing disruption, inconvenience, or violence. Now, if we think about freedom of assembly, the right to protest online, I think that the two major rights that are engaged are, on the one hand, the right to free expression, and on the other hand, the right to freedom of assembly. When thinking about these issues at Article 19, given the weakness of the right to freedom of assembly, we've tended to prefer to look at it from the perspective of free expression so as to avoid the sort of restrictions that I was mentioning earlier about timing, for instance, if you think about the organization of protests at any single time on the internet, or if you think about some of the other requirements that you find usually around protests offline, such as the notification requirements. Now, what forms of protest are we talking about when looking at the right to protest online? I think we can divide it, broadly speaking, into two aspects. One is when individuals use social media or other applications and tools to organize protests. I'm sure you'll all be familiar with protesters using Facebook, having a Facebook page to organize protests. You'll also be familiar with YouTube being used to upload videos about protests and recording in real time how they're happening, sometimes to document any violence that might be happening on the ground in relation to the protests on the ground. The use of Twitter in relation to, for example, either meeting points for having a protest, or sometimes people alerting each other to violence may be occurring in different places, and then the use of Google Maps to know where the protest is actually happening. So that's really the use of what we would see as the right for expression being used here. Now, the second aspect of online protests is also that they can be used as a venue for protests. So I'm sure you all remember when the internet went dark, and instead of getting access to Wikipedia and other websites, you only got a dark page in protests against the SOPA legislation in the US around copyright. In practice, so what you see in terms of forms of online protests, you might see the defacement of a website. So for example, when going to that website, you might get a particular message, such as the one below, and so you can't get access, for example, to a government site. Sometimes it's just redirecting, so that once you've been to that particular page, you'll be able to get access to the particular website. Sometimes there's a denial of service attack, so the page won't load, and effectively there will be no access to that particular website. And the site might just be taken down, and you'll get an error message. Now, in general, we found that there was very little international guidance or even case law in relation to what the protests online might constitute. And in reality, a lot of the time, these actions may well be criminal. If you look, for instance, at the European Convention on Cybercrime, a lot of these actions would fall under unlawful interference with the computer system. So that in practice, individuals may well be found liable under a number of provisions. Another recent example is a bill under the Spanish Criminal Code. This one was about criminalizing the dissemination by any means of messages or orders inciting disturbance of public violence. That's another example of how it might be criminalized. So when looking at this and faced with this reality, I think we need to ask ourselves, and at the very least encourage the prosecuting authorities to look at whether or not there's a public interest in the prosecution when these actions were taken for the purposes of protests. Another thing to look at is whenever these prosecutions are going ahead is the extent to which the purpose of the activity, and insofar it was not to create damage and the damage itself was not substantial, should be taken into account when looking at the sanctions. In developing the right to protest principles and looking at these issues, we've teased out some of the basic principles that should be taken into account, which I've already mentioned to some extent, but which you can find here. And now I'm going to come to some of the other issues that we need to think about. So when we're talking about protest, and this time moving back to protest offline, I think there are at least 3 issues that we really need to focus on and that perhaps haven't deserved quite the attention that they need to. One is anonymity. We've already discussed anonymity, like for instance in the Brazilian context, but what that means in terms of the organization of protests. If you think about, for example, that notification requirement I was mentioning earlier, if there's nobody that you can really identify from a policing perspective to organize the operational policing around it. There's also the issue of open signals intelligence, and the extent to which when individuals are communicating on Twitter about a protest, some of that information may be not only recorded, but perhaps put into databases, and what that means, so that individuals are not necessarily aware that when they're attending protests, maybe both their communications might be scooped up in relation to Twitter, or more generally, just because they've been attending that protest, they might be identified and then put in a database. And finally, there's the issue of the reporting on protests and protecting the media. And this is going back to the issue of having the ability, when individuals are on the ground, to report on what's happening. So these are some of the issues that we've looked at in our right to protest principles. I would invite you to visit the site, and I'll be very happy to discuss in more detail during the questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gabrielle. Now that she has introduced the issues, I want Harry. She will help us with some experiences.
Yeah, so I work at MIT on open standards related to cryptography and browsers and all of that stuff. So some of my work is in everyone's browser today. Unfortunately, I know quite a lot about the right to protest because I was labeled a terrorist by the US and UK authorities due to being involved in protest activity. In particular, I was involved in protest against what we thought were rampant corruption in the banking sector and the overreach of neoliberal trade treaties, particularly the WTO. And after that, I was involved in what was in the UK was known as the climate camp movement, which was a family-friendly social movement who basically sort of said that the goal to prevent catastrophic climate change, we need to keep the coal in the ground, and that we need to basically stop releasing more CO2 into the air. In 2008, when I was involved in this was considered very radical, even though now with the UN summit in climate change coming up in Paris in a few weeks, this is now viewed as consensus, both within science and increasingly even within the political elite of the United States, the UK, and the rest of the world. However, at that time, they were the various police forces were so terrified of protests that they sent undercover police, targeted surveillance, not just mass surveillance, but targeted surveillance, aimed at activists in order to disrupt their right to protest. I've seen, myself personally, when I had an undercover police officer called Mark Kennedy, basically, when I told him, hey, I got a job at MIT, that information in violation of data exchange principles, but don't worry, they used a national security exception, was sent to the FBI, who then opened a grand jury. And then as soon as I got off the airplane into my home country, my laptop was seized. I was put in a small room and interrogated and told I was never going to get out. When they finally did let me out, the FBI entered MIT, attempted to intimidate various professors, and threatened me. They entered, of course, under false pretenses. When I returned to the UK, I had my DNA taken under Schedule 7, which is now more or less viewed as not particularly legal in terms of human rights, and was more or less forced out of the country which I had been living and doing my PhD in for 7 years. This isn't really the worst. I've had friends where undercover police officers basically would engage in sexual relations with them in order to obtain intelligence about climate change protest. I've seen the British police will use the names of dead children in order to basically make their cover story more believable. And we've even seen, we've seen the FBI drive young activists like Aaron Swartz, who was a good friend, to suicide. Because that's how afraid even supposedly civilized countries are of protest. But fighting back in court, I'm okay today. And I actually have a lot of faith in young people and the right to protest. Even though my life was personally destroyed for several years, when we saw the anonymous actions, defending the right to leak acts against human rights and against corruption to the world to make people aware, I was thrilled. When we've seen even, more recently, a young 13-year-old hack the CIA director of the CIA's email account in solidarity with repressed people. I actually feel that the younger kids today are all right, and they're facing a very grim future. They're facing catastrophic climate change. They're facing long-term unemployment. And they're facing problems which my generation has yet to really fully grasp. And I think the best thing that we can do today is that in order to ensure that, these young people don't have to go through pure hell, but can actually have the right to protest and the right to fix these large-scale social problems which our current political class has been unable to fix. If we can guarantee that right, and we can guarantee that right via getting the laws right, and I appreciate Article 19's right to protest, we can eliminate this ridiculous national security exception against these laws, which conflate activism with terrorism, which is completely absurd, but which is the purpose of most of these absurd, cowardly national security exemptions, which make a farce of data protection and human rights. And if we can encode this, because if we can't even trust our governments, if we can encode these fundamental rights into the code of the internet itself, into the protocols, which is what Snowden is asking for, and it was what Tim Berners-Lee has mentioned in possibilities of the Magna Carta for the internet, and Sandy Pentland, the New Deal for data. If we can encode our rights into the actual infrastructure of the internet, we can give future generations the possibility to not only have the right to protest, but to actually fix a very broken society and a very grim future that they're inheriting. So I think we need to do this, not just for ourselves, but basically, for our children, who I'm actually quite happy with right now. That's it.
Thank you, Harry, for encouraging us. So now that you are talking about this special protection that we need in code, and according to all your recorded experience, maybe we can talk about now what the Council of Europe has been doing according to their standard setting on this right, maybe. Thank you.
Thank you very much. two words of introduction of the organization I work for. I work for the Council of Europe, which is an intergovernmental organization of 47 European states. The mandate of the organization is to defend human rights, democracy, and rule of law. So that's the focus of our organization. I'm working on media and internet policy issues. Now, as regards the right to protest that we are discussing here, I'll try to explain the engagement of our organization with standards in this field, especially with regard to freedom of assembly and association, which you, Gabriel, mentioned as a component of the right to protest, and which is actually the only right recognized in the European Convention on Human Rights. The right to protest, as you rightly mentioned, is not there. In the past years, the highest decision-making body of our organization, the Committee of Ministers, has issued a number of statements on the applicability of the right to freedom of assembly and association online. For example, in connection with domain names, the Committee of Ministers issued a statement saying that domain names are not only do not only have an addressing function; they also have a function of people can use domain names to express themselves, but also to associate in communities. Another statement has been on the freedom of privately operated platforms, internet platforms, as a means for the exercise of freedom of assembly and association. In another document, a guide to internet users regarding their human rights, we mention that ICTs and ICT tools and the internet can be used for the exercise of freedom of assembly and association, and the users are also reminded that should these tools be used in a disruptive way, there can be legal consequences, which is what we heard here about. Now, what we are doing right now is to explore the gray areas of the right to freedom of assembly and association in the Council of Europe. We are preparing a report on this right online, and there we started with a conceptualization of this right. How does it apply? How does Article 11 of the European Convention on Human Rights apply to the internet? Now, there we don't have much guidance, unfortunately, by the European Court of Human Rights on this, because there have been no cases brought to the court on internet and the right to freedom of assembly and association. But regardless of that, there are some principles which the court has pronounced in non-internet cases which are relevant to the world of the internet. For example, the court has said that the notions of assembly and association are autonomous and they are not defined, they are not constrained by whatever understanding member states have in their national laws about these notions. And that can be a very interesting principle, especially if we explore the so-called informal association that takes place online all the time. People just getting together, writing a petition, creating a Facebook group or in whichever other platform. Then in our paper, we also looked at the potential of ICT tools and the internet for association, and we explored. We saw that there are many cases in Europe actually where this is taking place. Users are using these tools to assemble and associate, especially when they want to demonstrate in the offline world. We saw that in the events related to the Gezi Park protests in Turkey, and there have been expressions, statements by the Council of Europe's Commissioner for Human Rights on the restrictions that took place in connection with those protests and how the internet was used. So in this paper, after we explore the potential, the positive use of these tools, then we struggled a little bit with the term peaceful assembly and association, because this is really the term that is used by the European Convention on Human Rights. What is a peaceful assembly and assembly online? And there we very clearly wanted to distinguish the activities such as those which took place, for example, in London in 2011, the riots in London, where ICTs, where mobile telephones were used actually to engage in urban violence. So we distinguished from that, and then we distinguished also from the use of the internet by the so-called Daesh group to recruit people into terrorist activities. And on that particular point, I'd like to mention that there is an additional protocol to the Council of Europe's Convention on Prevention of Terrorism, which has just been opened for signature. And that additional protocol criminalizes the recruitment to find in foreign territories of the recruitment of foreign terrorist fighters, including through the use of the internet. So the word internet appears actually in that additional protocol. So this is the first exploration that we did. Then we moved on in the ways that freedom of assembly and association is being restricted online. Blocking of internet platforms is one way how this is done, and unfortunately this is done in Council of Europe member states as well, where the entire platform is switched off just ahead of a major protest or a demonstration or a political gathering before even elections. So blocking and filtering of internet is considered one way of interfering with this freedom. Another way is the prosecution of individuals for their exercise of their right to association online. And that we have seen also in some Council of Europe member states. People have been arrested simply for tweeting on a gathering, again linked to political objectives or other societal preoccupations. That's another form of interference, prosecution, legal prosecution. Another area, which is, and now I'm moving into the so-called gray area, is the so-called civil disobedience, which you, Gabriel, mentioned. It is taken note in this work that we are doing, this report, that there are denial of service attacks, which are motivated perhaps politically. And yes, they do create disruption in the access to information and internet content. But perhaps this motivation, the intent, is very interesting and it should be noted. In the membership, in 47 Council of Europe member states, we've been able to identify one case which went before the courts. And that was a website defacement of the Lufthansa website in Germany. And the case went before the court. I don't have the details right now, but the court considered that there was indeed a political motivation behind that action, and there was no criminal liability derived in that case, recognized in that case. So the case law in member states is actually not, there are not many cases going to the courts. And this is a point, I think, which is of interest to be taken, to be noted here. But in our report, we have recognized exactly this, that there is a disruptive action online, which is maybe politically motivated, maybe may have some other societal preoccupations maybe behind it. And we are recommending in this work that we are doing that law enforcement authorities police and prosecutors, but also courts, be mindful of these elements whenever criminal cases are pursued in these situations. We also have looked at the implications of mass surveillance for the exercise of this freedom, assembly and association, and this is definitely one form of restriction of interference with this right and freedom. So this report will be mostly about taking stock of the situation, the legal standards in Europe, and trying to explore these gray areas. As I said, we are not at the moment embarking on a policy guidelines on this particular point. In this case, we see that there are some hesitations in some Council of Europe member states to actually prescribe a policy right now on this, but it's important to raise awareness of what are the issues involved with regard to the exercise of this right and freedom, the right to freedom of assembly and association. I will just add a last word. We are doing another activity. We are developing actually policy guidelines on internet freedom, and there we are recommending, this is not finalized yet, this policy, it's still a draft, but the key recommendation there is to invite all the 47 member states to evaluate themselves what is the state of internet freedom. And one of the components there is the right to freedom of assembly and association, and for that we have developed some indicators to help member states to complete this evaluation. For that, we have used the principles that the European Court of Human Rights has established in non-internet cases, but which can find an application in the internet-related cases. So I'll leave it at that, and I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Vanna. Okay, now we can ask Eleonora, that has joined us. Maybe how is Google dealing with protest as a concept, or something about the authorities' requests in this online protest concept? Okay. Thank you.
Company, we are committed to the value of freedom of expression, which includes protecting dissenting opinions from minorities, political criticism, and also the right to protest. So, some questions that you have asked me to talk about, like what are the trends that we see as a company, especially in Latin America, where I work as a policy manager, and what are we doing as a company to allow the users to use our platforms and the web to express protest, and the audiences to see what's happening. So let me start. One of the questions that you asked me is, what are we doing with YouTube, for example? YouTube is one of the, it's okay? Okay. YouTube is one of the platforms that our users use more to show different kind of political opinions, and specifically in countries where there are media blackouts, for example, YouTube and of course other internet platforms are very important ways of transmitting and showing to the public what's going on in times of protest. So we believe that protests require visibility. So although, for example, we have some community guidelines to prohibit violence in YouTube, when it's newsworthy, we allow the contents to be there. So we have received many requests to take down and to remove like content from YouTube that it's about like violence in protests or other issues that come within the protest, but we usually don't remove them because we believe that it seems worthy and it's a question, of course, of public interest. So if you have the protest online but nobody can see it, it doesn't have any sense. So that's one issue. On the issue of take down on user requests, well, we have to comply with the law, and we also like give like the data that is requested to us on the grounds of legal procedures. So we are committed to like fight to the bad laws that are in place in many countries. But we have like we only like comply with like the legal request. So that may be like the answer. And if you allow me to add some things, I think that we are seeing very worrisome trends in all over the world to diminish the right to freedom of expression and to protest online. And two things that I think that we have to do in order to strengthen the right to protest and the right to freedom of expression is, first, we believe that like intermediaries like Google and other companies are like sometimes the main points of control to remove content, to control the information that is on the internet. So we have to protect those intermediaries with safe harbors so that we can protect the information that is there, which is sometimes information about protest and people dissenting online. And on the other way, we have to protect, and I'm sure that we have talked a lot about this, anonymity online and encryption, and also we are fully committed to that. And we see that many governments try to undermine encryption worldwide because encryption has made content blocking and surveillance less effective, but we are as a company committed to improve like encryption and protect anonymity also.
Okay, thank you very much, Eleonora. So it seems that actually legislative and policy changes need to be made, and also according to all the law enforcement conducts from public forces or policing. But we would like to continue with some questions that you have directed to any of our guests. Anyone? Yes? Can someone? Okay. Thank you.
Well, of course, everyone have a right to protest, and online protests also realization of this right. But how to avoid some real criminal activities when those protests are coming to, for example, terrorist activities, not for general protesters, but terrorist movements could use these activities, in some countries. How to protect the society and protect peaceful protestants from these kind of threats. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Harry. Harry wants to answer this one.
So I would suggest not using words. I'm a computer programmer, so I like words with precise meanings, and words such as peaceful and violent and terrorist are notoriously imprecise. So I think, why don't you talk about what people actually do? So if Daesh cuts someone's head off, that's murder. They've killed a person. If the CIA drops a drone on a family wedding, searching because maybe there's a terrorist there and they kill a bunch of people, that's probably also murder, right? So what, if someone does an online protest and takes a website down for a few hours or a few days, that's taking a website down. That has some economic consequences, probably a cost, even if it's nonviolent civil disobedience by some regards. And so I think we can actually talk about, rather than kind of get lost in this kind of giant fog of peaceful and violent and terrorist and law-abiding or nation-state, whatever, regardless of the actor, why don't we actually try to talk about the actual crime and what the consequences of that crime are? Because the consequences for murder are pretty clear. Someone's no longer alive. The consequences for tweeting about a protest, you know, I don't really think that counts as terrorism on the same at all, and it shouldn't. So I think that's how I would approach the problem. I think then once you approach the problem that way, you can go through most of these things on a case-by-case basis and probably make sensible and non-hysterical decisions about them.
So I just want to add that I agree what you said, and we've seen in many Latin American countries that governments are enacting anti-terrorist law with very broad and vague words defining what a terrorist act is. And they have been used to diminish the right to protest and to dissent, online and offline. So we have to be very aware of that kind of legislation also, not only, I mean, especially in the developing countries.
Yes, and well, and not also anti-terrorism law. It's even also in cybercrime laws, no, that are being in kind of initiatives or of enacted laws. As for example, in Mexico, it happened like 2-3 weeks ago that a senator presented an initiative, yeah, known as the Ley Fayad, where he actually introduced a felony called terrorism or informatic terrorism or online terrorism. And according to its description, it could be a protest online. So, well, it wasn't approved, yeah, thanks to a lot of organizations that had a very specific and human rights standpoint on it. But well, I just wanted to point out that. Okay, any other question? You hear? Yeah, let's use the microphone.
Thank you, thank you. I would like to ask you if you find worry that nowadays we are so dependent on Google and Facebook companies to protest online. Usually we have to have an account in order to have access to search information. We have to log in, you have to have, you need to be part of it, to be a member of it. And doesn't it affect the freedom of expression? Thank you.
Thank you. Google wants to say something.
I won't answer for Facebook. Well, that's, I mean, of course, I mean, you have to register to use an account and you have to include the data that is required. I think that, I mean, you have a lot of possibilities to use many other and many services on the web, including Google, Facebook, Twitter, and whatever. So I don't think that free speech is hampered when you need to include certain data to allow for the functioning of the service. It's the only way that it can work.
And just a quick response. You know, there are alternative platforms. They don't have many users. I hope they get more users as more and more people realize that they're being censored by platforms like Twitter and Google and Facebook. So, you know, I work at the W3C. We have a group called the Social Web Working Group. We're trying to make standards around decentralized social networks, which allow people to have rights of anonymity and not have all the data centralized in one place. Google's not part of it, although we discussed and they showed up at the workshops. But we are seeing increased numbers of both alternative platforms happening and mainstream platforms, for example, Facebook, allowing people to access Facebook via Tor. And that's, I think, a really exciting effort.
Thank you. Okay, we have another question back there.
My name is Nikhat. I'm from Pakistan. I work for Digital Rights Foundation. My question is from Google. YouTube is banned in Pakistan. This is the third year that it's blocked by the government. And the reason is the anti-Islamic content and the blasphemous content. One of the petitioner from civil society filed a suit in the High Court to unblock YouTube, and Google was one of the party to that petition. But Google refused to respond to the High Court because they said that we do not fall in the jurisdiction of the court. So the and government of Pakistan and Google never came to an agreement to unblock the platform. So my question is that the ultimate people who are at the loss is the internet users in Pakistan who cannot use the platform. And the platform, the YouTube had been very critical to criticize government in the when the election was happening, and also disclosing some of the really important corruption of the state. So I don't understand that if the state is failed, if the platform is failed, where the internet users go and ask for their remedy.
Okay, I'm not aware of the details of that case about Pakistan. I will try to find more information and can provide an answer for you, because I'm not in the details of the legal case. I'm sorry.
Okay, yeah, there was another one back there.
There is an online question.
An online question?
Yes.
Yeah, it's from Maria Teresa Garrido from University for Peace in Costa Rica. I would like to ask if, in your opinion, including the right to protest in international binding documents can be a good solution for its protection.
Okay, Gabriel?
Well, I think in practice, coming to an agreement, adopting convention is always very difficult. So, sorry, just trying to. So I think in practice, it's likely that we'll have to work with what we've got. And from an international perspective, that's the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. There are other regional instruments, but I think, like, generally speaking, the gist of it would be for civil society organizations, whenever there's a case that comes up before these courts, either to actually bring them, for example, to the attention of the UN Special Rapporteur and try to get either these international mechanisms or domestic courts on the ground to adopt progressive standards, both in relation to the right to free expression and freedom of assembly.
Okay, thank you. There was this in the front. We had this one before. Can we? Thank you.
So, my name is André. I'm from Recife, from Brazil, and I'm from a group in Recife called Human Rights, and we claim something like try to apply the law in the urban planning in the city, and in the participation, like execution of sorry, I have a bad English. I will try to popular participation and in the city, and we face very problems there with the violation of human rights and the right to protest offline and online. That's one point. The other point is that recently in Brazil, that's approved. The Congress of the Brazil approved a law that use the terms, large terms, to like terrorism, and that terms applies to protest, and like what we do in Recife. So my question is like, how can we protect ourselves when the legal system and the Congress of the country have this kind of yeah. So we are citizens, and we don't have the base to act like citizens.
Do you want? Yeah.
So I mean, I do find the situation in Brazil sort of amusing because I'm pretty sure Dilma herself was definitely accused of terrorism quite a lot. And I would actually argue that, you know, large-scale social movements and the ability to cope with them and make them, you know, realize, you know, is actually a sign of a healthy society, a sign of a society which can regenerate itself in the face of decay and corruption and all sorts of problems. So, you know, even if you don't agree with them per se, I don't agree with all social movements. You know, some of them I don't agree with at all. I want them to have the right to exist. And I think the problem is, you know, I'm pretty lucky, right? Because I'm a white guy who's like a professor at MIT, so I can get away with a lot of stuff. But in many other countries, and Brazil might be one of them, you know, if you protest and you're repressed, you know, what happens? Do you get put in jail? Do you, you know, and I think that's how you got to think about it. And then you guys sort of say, well, you know, if the courts are against me and the government's against me, I have basically two options. One option is to try to use tools and protest anyways, and just sort of say, you know, I will be a public figure regardless, and I'll take the consequences. I'll possibly go to jail. You know, and that's a brave thing, and a lot of people have done that. It can go wrong. You know, Allah from Egypt and many other people are in jail now and in exile because of this situation. Or you can sort of say, you know, I can actually operate inside this country, and then you can leave and try to help the protests from far away, you know, another country if you're under personal danger, if you think you're in a personal danger. And the last thing I'd recommend is, regardless, you know, try to use some tools for digital self-defense to not just hand over all your data to possibly repressive forces. And there's a lot of workshops on this, but, you know, Tor and all these tools, Pigeon, OTR, you know, there's a lot of good people here who make these tools and have lots of workshops about these tools, and becoming familiar with them can help if you're the target of what you think is over-aggressive repression.
Okay, Gabriel also wants to add something.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that our office in Brazil is doing a lot of work on this. There was a website called protestos.org, where we're looking at some of the things you can do to protect yourself. If you also look at the Right to Protest website that I was mentioning earlier, there are two sections. One, which is about the principles and what we think should be the standards that we should push for in general in this area. But then there's another section around security and some of the tools that Harry just mentioned.
Okay, we can have one more question. No one else? Okay.
Hi, great panel. My name's Neil Schwartzman. I'm with the Coalition Against Unsolicited Commercial Email. I think it's super important to remember that every single piece of infrastructure that has been mentioned thus far is a commercial entity. And that is entirely dependent, whether or not they share your data with governments, is entirely dependent on commercial interests. They do not care about the individual, they care about the quarterly stock report. And that can change from time to time. Sometimes they are immensely supportive. Other times they will provide an open door policy to government. And that scares me more than anything, is that people are doing protests based on a house of cards. Anyways, you guys rock. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, so does anyone here wants to add something, like a final comment? Yes, thank you.
Thank you. From a legal perspective, I wouldn't like to comment on the Brazilian situation because I don't know that. I think what is important is to build in the legal frameworks the safeguards for human rights, and not only the right to assembly and associate, but for all human rights. And to also adopt a more relaxed approach to the usage of terms. I understand here the term terrorism creates some sort of reaction, but and it's considered as not defined. But international law has terms like that. For example, national security, you might consider that as a completely undefined term as well. And yet that is a legitimate aim in, for example, the European Convention on Human Rights to pursue, a government can pursue that aim to and restrict fundamental rights and freedoms. Now, that should be done in a proportionate way and only when that's necessary. And it's the necessity and proportionality safeguards that should be built in the legal frameworks. I think that this is what we should all ask for, and we should actually hold the authorities accountable to achieving that goal.
And on that note, I think it is important if you feel like your right to protest either online or offline or increasingly mixed is being taken away, it is important to basically fight back legally if you can, right? So, we had national security exemptions used against climate change protesters. They brought the court in the UK and they argued and had a surprising amount of success, basically arguing that catastrophic climate change, which we were protesting, is a larger threat to national security than people marching with signs and even stopping coal-burning power plants from being built. I think that's a good point, and that I'm currently getting ready to challenge the UK government over how they were defining and criminalizing protest as relevant to national security and using undercover police. And I'd recommend that everyone who's in this kind of situation, I mean, once you're kind of safe and you're not actually under physical threat, you should try your best to work with nonprofits and solicitors and lawyers and all these great people in order to try to push your case forward, because this does set it, you can fight back, and the fighting back in the terrain of law is another terrain of struggle.
Well, actually, as you know, Article 90 has been developing these principles. What would be great, actually, is to hear from as many of you as possible as to what you think about them. They're not final. So it'd be great to hear your thoughts about it. Are there any other issues that we may have missed? Other experiences or other things that you'd like to share with us? So you can contact me or my team. So my name is Gabrielle at article19.org. You can also contact our legal team at legal@article19.org and to discuss this further and hopefully identify opportunities for advocacy. If this is a problem in your country, we'd be very interested in talking to you about how we could work together on these issues. So, thank you.
Eleonora, something? No?
Hard issue, so I'm hoping to discuss this further with all of you during the week in the IGF.
Thank you very much. So in the meanwhile, I think that we all conclude that we need to raise awareness regarding the protection of these rights, protests online. Thank you very much.